with Laurie Sanders, who all we have too much fun together. I wanted to offer a word about why having Bill Newman here to do a living history is so important to us. We're doing something that I call collecting for the 22nd century, if you can believe it. So just think about a child born this year would be 82 in 2100, that's the 22nd century. And we need to be collecting things about our world so that we leave them behind, we leave it behind for them. And I think we only have to look around us at this wonderful exhibit to understand how important that is. So Henry Gare, who was the editor of the Hampshire Gazette for a million years, was in Baton Rouge, had a Baton Rouge experience during the Civil War, and he came back with him when he came back were 18 small photographs, and the reproductions are on the wall right over there next to Alicia, and the originals are in the back room, and they come out when we have room for the case. But he brought them home. He died in 1914, which was 49 years after the end of the Civil War. His daughter let them hang around where she was, and she gave them 30 or 40 years later to us. And fast forward another 60 or 70 years, Bruce Laurie found them with the help of Marie Panic here at the museum, and did the research and created this wonderful exhibit about what he left behind. So what we leave behind is so important. He also left a book. He left a book of his reminiscences of life on Main Street in the 1840s. And he wrote this in the 1890s. So he wrote it about the 1840s. And for us, we're going to use it come spring in an exhibit that'll be right about where that where the libations table is, will be a model of Main Street in the 1840s using the research that he left behind. It'll be 12 feet long, and it'll be Main Street from the railroad up through to the canal. It'll be 1845, the last year when the railroad and the canal were together in the same town. So, be ready for that. So, but tonight we look forward to recording some of the recording for the 22nd century, and look forward.
I feel so old.
No, you're the young
I'm doing this 144. What? Yeah. Sorry.
No. It is. It's a little daunting. We're just going to keep it. And what I was thinking is that people they're going to be interested in what you say. But if they look at the video, they're going to be looking at what you're wearing. They're going to be looking at your hair. They're going to be looking at what we ate, what we drank, and what everybody else in the audience was asking. So get ready for the new century. Laura.
Well, before I say a few things about Bill, I want to just acknowledge our sponsors, which are WHMP, River Valley Market, Joe's Pizza, which really came through for us, and NCTV has provided the cameras and all the equipment. So the other thing that's just so nice tonight about tonight's Living History series, this is something that Betty and I conceived of when we started it, now it's 2.5 years ago. And we've only had a few of these Living History series events, but we began with Northampton star Francis Crowe, who's here tonight. And over the last couple of years, we've had Jim Armenti, who's also in the room. And Yvonne Frashero, who couldn't make it tonight, and also Annie Woodhull and Gordy Thorne. And so, and there are several people in this room who could also be in the place where Bill is, and I hope you will at some point in the future. Northampton is an extraordinary town, and we're just so lucky. Many of you already know Bill, either professionally or personally. But if you hadn't met him in person, some of you, including a couple here who come up from Enfield, they know him as a voice on the radio. Some of you know him.
So disappointed. A face for radio. I got it.
author as the voice and author of a podcast called the Civil Liberties Minute. And one of his books, his latest book, is on sale tonight. And some of you I know have bought it, but Bill has signed some of those copies if any of you are interested. Before I turn it over to Bill, I thought I'd cover sort of the early years of his life. Get through that part so we can get to the really more interesting, or potentially more interesting part. So he spent his first 10 years living with his family, his brother and sister, in a place called Harrison, New York, which is not far from the Connecticut border, and about 30 minutes by train from New York City. At around the age of 10, he moved to New York City, where he was there for a few years, and at the age of 13, then he moved to Northwestern Connecticut, where he started at the Hotchkiss School. At the prep school, he was the co-editor of the school's literary magazine. He wrote for the yearbook. He was the president of the Current Events Club. And among other extracurricular activities, Jim, this is important for you, he was a bass guitarist in a rock and roll band. But just so you don't think that Bill excelled at absolutely everything, he wants you to know that he did flunk Latin. The summer before his senior year, the school had a program called the Greater Opportunity Program, and it gave him the chance to work in the inner city as a counselor and meet and live with teenagers. And he said at that point he saw that they faced obstacles that he couldn't imagine, and that they were amazing young people, and it was one of the early experiences that changed who he was. After graduating from high school, he decided to go to Antioch College, and as part of Antioch's program, which some of you may be aware of, they have a work-study program. So he spent a year working for a new organization in New York City, which was working on criminal justice reform. And as part of that, he reviewed criminal charges and records and police reports to help determine if the defendants, who were only men, might qualify for the program. Most of them were young, all of them were poor, many of them, or the majority of them, were black or Hispanic, and he said they entered a maze that few of them could escape. And he hated people seeing locked up in cages, which he still does. After he returned to Antioch, he came back. Francis, this is relevant to you. He came back with a draft deferment intact and a new understanding of privilege and poverty. After college, he decided to apply for law school. And I'm going to leave it now to Bill to describe those intervening years, but I wanted to wrap up by sharing this part, that Bill and his law partners at Lesser, Newman, Aleo, and Nassar are longtime Massachusetts and New England super lawyers. The U.S. News and World Report regularly selects his firm as one of the best law firms in America. That Bill has received numerous awards for his work, and that he's been named one of the best lawyers in America. In addition to all the hats he wears, he's the director of the Western Regional Law Office of the American Civil Liberties Union of Massachusetts, which he helped found 30 years ago. So please join me in welcoming a man who has spent his entire career working for social justice and those who need it most. Bill Newman.
Thanks very much. It's all downhill from here, really. My dad used to say, when your time comes to speak, better to remain silent, say nothing, and be thought a fool than to speak up and remove all doubt. So, so a couple quick notes, if I might. On this book, between Steve Strymer and me, we've given the books to Historic Northampton. If you buy one, all of the proceeds go to Historic Northampton, so if you would, we would appreciate that. Look, the first part of my life, I'm so glad somebody else did it because, hi, privileged white male, goes to private schools. This has a potential to be a really boring story. So I thought what I might talk about some is to start where Lori left off, which is on transformative experiences. And what she was describing was my first co-op job from Antioch College, which was with the Manhattan Court Employment Project of the Vera Institute of Justice. And it was one of the first projects in the court systems in America that allowed for defendants to be taken out of the system, and if they complied with various conditions, to have the charges against them dismissed. All the counselors in this program were ex-cons, ex-felons. They had done an average of 8 or 9 years in some of the hardest prisons in New York, the upstate New York prisons. These people were serious, they were really tough, and they were really good counselors. And working with them was transformative. Hearing their life stories, some of which I tell in this book. I'll tell one now. We had a card, obviously, to get us in and out of the jails. And we worked at 100 Center Street, the Manhattan Criminal Courts. And it was one of the most horrifying experiences, day in and day out, that you can imagine. And one day, before we could take someone into the program, the counselors had to approve the person coming into the program, which was they'd have their case deferred for a certain amount of time. They'd have to go to the counseling sessions and the group counseling sessions. There was an employment component of the project and or a school aspect of it. They had to comply with and be involved in job training or school, go to counseling, and if all the conditions were met, the charges would be dismissed. Before they could be accepted into the program, they had to be approved by one of the counselors. And for reasons that I don't quite recall anymore, we couldn't do it in the holding cells behind the arraignment session that day, and the counselor's name was Rip, and I end up in the tombs, which is what the jails were called, behind the courthouse, and we go and talk to this young man in a cell, and we accept him into the program, and Rip is showing his card as he walks out, and he said, I used to dream about being able to have those doors open, and now all I have to do is show them this card, and they open it for me. And then we walked out into the sunlight, and I said, I can't imagine having to stay inside there for 8 or 9 or 10 years. What he lived through and what he was able to live through and come out and make this life and be this extraordinary person, well, I think he was always an extraordinary person, but to show that in a way that was so productive and so meaningful and so helpful to other people, you just don't meet people like that all the time. At least I hadn't met people like that all the time. There was something else going on at 100 Center Street in 1968, which is every morning when we went to work, the Black Panthers were on the outside of 100 Center Street, hundreds, every day, because the Panther 21 trial, and at that point the pretrial proceedings were going on. And I don't know quite how to describe this. I came from this privileged, boring background, and I'm thrust into this situation, and I think going to work involves walking past 100 or 200 Black Panthers with their berets on, saying good morning. And that's how the day started. That's how the day started for months. And what I learned by working in the criminal courts, and what I learned by seeing that political organizing, was the power of people working together. People look back at the Panther 21 trial and say, oh, of course it was going to be dismissed. It wasn't, of course, going to be dismissed. It was an extraordinary confluence of events that ended up with the dismissals. And it was, in fact, people working together from many, many corners of society and coming together to say, there is something really important here, there is a value at stake here, there is something about this trial that needs our attention and our support. And I didn't learn that exactly by studying it, but I learned it a bit by osmosis. And you could see it day in and day out in the courtroom. You saw the people who came to court, and they had people with them, and they had friends, and they had relatives, and they had supporters. And it kind of worked out for them so much better than people who were there alone, who had no one. I wanted to mention a few other experiences like this. And my last quarter at Antioch, where I was theoretically studying, and mostly that was theoretical, I was in a class that I did go to. It was taught by a woman named Mary Kaufman. Mary Kaufman was an attorney, and she was one of the prosecutors of I.G. Farben after the Second World War, I.G. Farben being the German military-industrial machine that supplied Germany with its munitions and with all of its wherewithal to fight the Second World War. I.G. Farben's case, actually, the principals never went on trial because after Nuremberg, the American government said, we actually need those Germans to help us in the Cold War. And Mary never forgave the United States government for not allowing that prosecution to go forward. That said, that spring, there was a demonstration at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. And there were a lot of arrests of Antioch students. And we formed a defense committee. And Mary Kaufman, reasonably enough, was in charge. And what happened there is what happened and what happens all the time. There were, misdemeanor charges of one sort or another against dozens and dozens, maybe even 100 or more of the white students. And then there were assault and battery and resisting arrest and assault and battery on police officer charges brought against 2 or 3 of the black students. And the prosecutors offered all the white students a dismissal. The white black students, they wanted to put on trial. Well, the question is, were those 100 or 200, I don't remember how many white students, going to sell out the black students? And the answer to that was Mary Kaufman was going to die before that was going to happen. And so were the students. I wasn't sure that was going to work out that way. And in fact, by standing together and just saying no, all of those charges ended up being dismissed. And that's an extraordinary lesson on the power of solidarity and the power of people staying together and not being willing to give up one for the benefit of themselves. After I had 4 co-op jobs from Antioch. I worked at the Vera Institute, as I mentioned. I worked for a literary magazine, Trans-Pacific. I worked at a preschool for 6 months. Okay, I was a horrible preschool teacher. Let's be clear. But I thought I might want to teach, and I thought this was a good place to try it out. And the formative experience for me was, okay, part of this was during the winter, and so you get the kids' clothes on, and you get the boots on, and you get the hats on, and you get them all ready in the snowsuit, and they get to the door, and Edwin says, "Teacher, I gotta pee." You say, okay, great, I understand. I so didn't have the patience for this, but it so taught me how amazing the jobs that teachers do every day. I don't know what the verb is at this point, but it's extraordinary. And having to work with kids and work with a teacher who was, in fact, a really skillful teacher taught me an enormous amount and gave me incredible respect for teachers. And then I worked at the Urban Law Institute, which was at that point the Urban Law Institute of Antioch College. It was doing mostly doing a class action lawsuit against redlining for mortgages in the D.C. area. And I worked in what now would be called the comms department. It taught me a lot about writing, taught me a lot about presentation, taught me a lot about organizing media campaigns, which has come in has been very useful skill, particularly around labor organizing that I've been involved in, and in representing the housekeepers and food service workers at Smith College, which I no longer but I did do for some 35 years. When I was in law school, having gotten addicted to this co-op program, I went to Northeastern University School of Law, which has a co-op program. And I worked for Zalkind and Silverglate, Norman Zalkind, Harvey Silverglate, who are still 2 of the best criminal defense lawyers in, I think, the country and certainly in the state. I mostly worked for Norman on a murder case, and continued to do the work when I went back to law school and was there for the trial. And my second job was with Texas Rural Legal Aid in Edinburgh, Texas, where I was, because I was a law student and we could do this, I handled administrative hearings, Social Security and welfare, unemployment and the like. And there was one, there's more than one, but there was at least one problem with this, which is I only knew how to prepare one kind of a case, a murder case. Okay, so this put me in some difficulty with the Social Security hearing officer who did not understand why someone was walking in with this much paper, these many exhibits, and a witness list that went on for 2 pages, because that's just not how they were done. But to me, it was an invaluable lesson, because at Texas Rural Legal Aid, they said, you can't win these cases. They're just unwinnable. The hearing officers never rule for you. But I didn't understand that. I didn't know that. And I didn't know this is how cases were prepared. And I managed to win most of them by sheer, I think, will. That they had to win. I was so convinced they had to win that if you put enough effort in and it came in with enough law and enough research and showed that you really believed in this person, that in and of itself had a value. And there was one other piece that I think helped with that job and with my next job at the Alaska Public Defenders. In Alaska at that time, I mean, it had been a state since 1959, but a lot of the law was unformed. You could make it up. Okay, so it's like being a judge, except that you're the lawyer or the law student. You can just make it up. And I worked on a brief for a very long time on whether social workers should have the same privilege as psychotherapists. There was kind of no law on it. There was some old Alaska law, but it wasn't the law. And I did write and could write anything from anywhere in any jurisdiction explaining why social workers should have the same privilege as other therapists. And to me, the lesson was you can be creative. You can, I don't encourage judges to do this, but make it up. Because it can be convincing. And it often was. So I ended up in Northampton because my last job was working for Arthur Sirota, who is David Hoos's first law partner. And that was my last co-op job. And I had met Tom Lesser, who was working on jury challenges with Arthur at the time. And I came back and I ran into him in court because I'd been offered a job at Student Legal Services at UMass, which I didn't really want to take. But I was theoretically, and in some reality, in a relationship with a woman in Boston, and we thought we should at least live in the same jurisdiction. So moving back to somewhere in Massachusetts seemed to be an improvement in relationship. And I ran into Tom Lesser, who, if you know Tom, has kind of a Buddhist quality to him. And I said, here's who I am, and the lawyers introduced us. And he said, oh, I know, I've been waiting for you to come back. I said, really? Okay. So we went out for dinner, and we formed a law partnership. I want to talk about a few cases that I did, some early on, because I think that the lessons that I learned at the Vera Institute and with Mary Kaufman and at Texas Rural Legal Aid all came into play and were very helpful to me. One was, well, let me tell this story. I'm sitting in the courtroom in Franklin Probate Court, and my co-counsel, brilliant lawyer, and my partner for many years, Wendy Sibison, was next to me. It was during the lunch break. I think people were coming back into the courtroom, and this was the case of Bunny King. This was the first lesbian custody case, the first gay custody case that ever went before any state's highest court. At the moment, we were in probate court in Franklin County arguing about a guardianship or the dissolution of a guardianship. And I looked around, I said to Wendy, I said, wow, you know, the judge and I are the only two guys in this courtroom. And she said, Bill, you are missing the big picture. And I said, what? She said, the big picture is that you and I and the judge are the only three straight people in the courtroom. I said, okay, got it. Now, there's one other story that I think comes into play here, because in fact, during Bunny's case, the LGBTQ community supported her enormously. And that courtroom was packed every day with her supporters. And at the time, there was no legal protection in employment law because of one's sexual preference. And we waited for the reporters to not be in the courtroom, and we put her partner on the stand. And then Ralph Gordon, who's the reporter, the Franklin County bureau chief for the Springfield, then the Union News, walks back in the courtroom and listens to her testify. The testimony was fine. The testimony was great. The testimony was helpful. But her name in the paper would have cost her her job. She taught at a public school. So Wendy and I spent the lunch hour in Ralph's office on Main Street in Springfield, begging, cajoling, pleading, anything for him to not put her name in the paper. And Ralph was one of these just the facts kind of reporters. And he said, it's a public courtroom. She was on the stand. She made the statements. Of course I have to put her name in the paper. So we spent 59 out of the 60 minutes of the lunch hour begging Ralph and went back to court feeling horrible. Got up the next morning, checked the paper, and Ralph had not included her name. And I think he didn't, in significant part because of all of the people in that courtroom who clearly showed admiration, respect, and love for Bunny. Her name was Brenda Bizio. And I think that community effort had an enormous effect on the case and on the reporting and on the ultimate outcome. One last story on this case, if I might, because I think it's telling. Not the fact that I left the file there, which also would lapse in minded, but okay. But beyond that, I did leave the file in the courtroom, being accordion file, one of many, when we left after the trial was over. And I recognized that fact. I was in the car, and I went back to the courtroom, and there was the judge, Sanford Keaty, sitting on the bench. This is probably 15 or 20 minutes after we walked out of the courtroom, and he was deep in thought. He did not hear me come in. I wasn't sneaking into them, but he was just so absorbed, and he was clearly really bothered by what he had heard or what he thought he was going to decide. And what he ended up doing, on one hand, you could say, was horrible, and on the other hand, was actually extraordinarily helpful. What he did in his decision is he said, her lifestyle, which is to say a homosexual relationship, I mean, he was really uncomfortable with all this, it creates this inherent instability in the household, and therefore Bunny should not have her kids back. That's what he said. It was really helpful that he said that, because he was a probate court judge, and if he had used any other reasons, it would be much more difficult to say, this is the reason and this is the issue that the Supreme Judicial Court should take and should rule on in the case. But he wrote a really honest decision. That's what bothered him. Otherwise, he would have given the kids back to mom. And the Supreme Judicial Court ruled he should have given the kids back to mom. That's his reason? That's not a good enough reason. As a matter of fact, it's an irrelevant reason. And I think that the community being involved in the case in the way in which the community was, including the dozens of women who came and testified about her and about her kids. Yeah, there was expert testimony. Yes, there were police officers who came who were very helpful to us. That all been said, I think that the community's involvement was really pivotal. In the same way, I think the other case that was transformative for me was the seditious conspiracy case, which involved the Levasseurs and they had been convicted of a series of bank robberies and some bombings in New York. They were then charged with seditious conspiracy, conspiracy to overthrow the United States government by force or violence. Now, how exactly 4 families with kids were going to overthrow the United States government by force or violence, you might wonder about, and I did. There were some of the most talented lawyers I've ever worked with on that case, including Liz Fink, who represented the Attica plaintiffs for some 25 years, and Bob Boyle, whose name you probably hear from time to time. He is still Mumia Abdul-Jamal's lawyer. And in that case, there was a community of people in this area who supported the defendants. There was a support committee, a defense committee. And among other things, they had T-shirts. It said seditious conspiracy, or the Ohio 7, and it said join the conspiracy. I wouldn't recommend that T-shirt today, but at the time, it was helpful. What happened in the case is that William Young, who had been the governor's counsel and then a Superior Court judge and then a federal district court judge and still is, was assigned specifically from Boston to come to Springfield to preside over the case. And Bill Young, I don't know quite how to put this, but he was alive in the 60s, I was alive in the 60s, and we were living in different worlds. That was really clear. So we wrote Bill Young, Judge Young, a memorandum. It was titled "Motion to Dismiss or Alternatively for Bail." And my client, and later Liz Finks and my client, Pat Levasseur, had become eligible to be released because she had served her 5-year sentence for harboring a fugitive, to wit her husband, and she was now eligible to be released even though she was facing, I can't tell you how much time, endless amounts of time in federal prison for these 3 charges: RICO, racketeering conspiracy, racketeering substantively, and seditious conspiracy. We filed a motion for bail and wrote a 50 or 60 page memorandum trying to explain the 1960s to Judge Young and how people could become involved in something like this that they were allegedly involved in. And since most of the other defendants had already been convicted of the substantive underlying crimes, Judge Young, I don't think, had exactly a serious question about whether they were involved or not. But let her out on bail, and the prosecutors thought this was ridiculous. He's never going to do that. So we made a proposal. Why doesn't Pat come live with one of the lawyers? Because she's not exactly a great bail candidate. She doesn't live in the area. She has no ties to the community. She has no money. And she's facing a gazillion years in prison. Why is anyone going to let her out? Because we vouched for her and said we wanted her to come live with one of the lawyers. So the first person to put on the stand in that hearing was my wife, Dale Melcher. And I asked her name and her address, and I said, I do know the answer to this question: are you married? And the prosecutors, after a while, got the idea that Judge Young was actually thinking about releasing her. And then he did release her on her own recognizance with so many conditions I can't even begin to tell you, but he let her out. And he let her out, I think, in part because there were people from the community in that courtroom every day showing that they supported her. It mattered. And it mattered at that trial that that jury saw every day that Pat Levasseur walked in and walked out of that courtroom, because they for sure knew that if they convicted her, she wasn't going to walk out of that courtroom again. So what I take from all of this is the importance of community, the importance of support, the importance of working both the law and criminal defense law in particular, but also substantive law reform on the criminal side matters when there is community and there is support, when there is a synthesis of belief and action and organizing. And I'm not going to try to delve into organizing too much with Francis Crowe sitting here in front of me critiquing this. However, Francis will support this idea. Oh, let me just tell you a story about Francis, okay? So Francis is in my office one day. You don't mind Francis. It's slightly intrusive on the attorney-client privilege, but not much. And I'm standing there talking to Francis, and I have something in my possession, or had at the time, very few people ever had. I had Francis Crowe's criminal arrest record. And I don't know, you remember the old computers with the spindles and all the old linears, and they would just, all the papers would be connected together? So I took Francis's record, and I pulled it out. And it went up all the flights of stairs, 2 flights of stairs. It was like 40 feet long. And it was the first time I heard Francis say something. I said, Francis, exactly how many times have you been arrested? And her answer has always been, not enough. In the cases that I've been involved in, and I think this was really brought home to me because Lori had asked me, he said, well, send me your resume. And I had it. And what it shows is that in the overwhelming percentage of cases that I've been involved in, that I take some pride of having been involved in, I've had brilliant co-counsel, experienced co-counsel, and the involvement of the community in ways that made the outcomes possible. When I was representing the food service workers and the dormitory workers at Smith, the students were indispensable. How did we know they were indispensable? Well, in case we were looking for proof, we're sitting at the negotiation table, and the college's demand was, and further, you have to agree that you will never bring students to the negotiations again. Yeah. And we organized the students at graduation one year. Boy, did the college hate that. It was tremendously successful. This is true, I think, for all of the cases, at least most of the cases in which I've been involved that I think represent these values. And I'd like to conclude by telling you one story about the case that was most important in my life, at least in my legal life, and that's the death penalty case that I did with Brian Stevenson and Buzz Eisenberg. And so this is David Huss's fault. How do you get me into these things? I don't know. We were out for breakfast one day. Who says, I have a friend, George Kendall, and he's running the ACLU office, Southern Regional Office, because there weren't state offices in every state at the time, and he's running the ACLU's death penalty project in the South, and I'm doing one of these cases, and I think you should do one of these cases. So he didn't want to turn David down. I love David. I said, sure, have George call me. So George called me, and I listened for a while, and I said, and this was true, I forget if it was the seditious conspiracy case coming, something was coming up. And I said, I'm really, really busy. Why don't you call me in 6 months? George Kendall is a name you've probably heard. He works for the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund as one of their leading anti-death penalty lawyers. Anyway, so I spoke to George Kendall for a while, and I said, look, why don't you call me in 6 months? Now, in the lawyer world, that's kind of like, thank you very much, I'm sure you're a nice person, we'll talk next lifetime. Really, that's what it means, right? 6 months and 2 days later, George Kendall called because I didn't say the one thing that he took as a no, which was no, never, I'm not doing it. And he called. And he said, I have these 3 cases, these people don't have lawyers, and there are going to be execution dates set. Would you take one of these cases? And I said, oh, mostly this is, let me off the phone, please. Fine, send me the advance sheet, send me the decisions from the court, which he did. And then 3 days after the letter showed up, he calls again. And he said, so which one are you going to take? I said, this is not going exactly how I had planned it. But I had read one of these cases and was, in fact, appalled. 18-year-old kid, no prior record, is now on death row. So I said, okay, all right, if you have great local counsel. He said, well, I have someone who's great local counsel. He's very inexperienced. He's only been doing this a couple of years, but he's really smart. He's really going to be somebody someday. His name is Brian Stevenson. Which allows me to say I knew Brian Stevenson before he was Brian Stevenson. So I end up down in Georgia doing this case, and one day Brian and I go to the scene of the crime. And we go to the courthouse where the trial was, and we look at all the evidence in the back rooms. They're still in boxes. And we're about to take a 4-hour trip back from Sea Island, Georgia to Atlanta. And during the last couple of hours that we've been in town, we've been trailed by a big white American car. And we're about to go off into a bit of 4 hours of highway where every 30 or 40 miles there's a Stuckey's, and other than that, it's all woods. If someone wanted to kill you, that'd be a pretty good place to do it. And I said to Brian, because we were talking about the car that was tailing us, and I said, what are the odds that we're about to die? And Brian said, not that high. And I said, let's try that again. I said, remember me? I live in Northampton, Massachusetts. If we have 2 OUIs on a Friday night, it's a crime spree. And when I ask you what are the odds we're about to die, you've got to do better than not that guy. You've just got to. And he did have quite a sense of humor, and does have quite a sense of humor. And he said, look, what makes me nervous is when I have a new murder case and I'm driving to the jail and I drive past homemade signs that say, welcome to Klan country. That makes me nervous. Some car trailing us, that doesn't make me nervous. And I came back to Northampton after that trip, and friends, colleagues wanted to know where I'd been, what I'd been doing, and people were enormously supportive. When we came to the writing of this brief for the federal district court 8 years later, dozens of people showed up over the weekend, lawyers and law students and support staff, and just people from the community said, how can I help? What can I read? Can I edit? What can I do? And in a matter of 10 days, we put together a 156-page brief for the court because he gave us 10 days. And the community support was something that just filled me with joy and pride, but it also showed me what a difference it makes, because the people down south where we work, and David Hoos has done a dozen of these cases, I've done one, those people do not have, at least did not have, this kind of support and love for the community where they work. Yes, there is an anti-death penalty community, but it wasn't and isn't like it was for us to work here. And so the lesson that I draw from all of this is that what we give to each other comes out and develops into a manner of being in the world that allows us to be better people and to accomplish a lot together. So thank you all so much. So this is the point where you have some questions. I saw Mike Ryan in the back, so I want to just make one other note. I do. There was a case that we were trying very hard to. Oh, thank you so much. We were trying very hard to avoid a certain judge in Superior Court. May I mention his name? He is, but he has relatives, and they're alive. Anyway, so Mike Ryan's son, whose son Luke, who's a brilliant lawyer, David Hoose's partner, one of the best lawyers I've ever worked with and will continue to work with. I just admire it greatly. But at the time, he was in, what, 11th grade? And we had a case that came to the ACLU from a girl whose name was Nikki Wing. Kind of central casting. If you're going to have a soccer team, Nikki Wing. You can't do better than that. And Nikki was a student at Gateway. And Gateway did not have a girls' soccer team. It only had a boys' soccer team. So she played on the boys' soccer team. And she was pretty good. And Gateway made it into the tournament. And then the Massachusetts Interscholastic Athletic Association said, nope, this team cannot play in the tournament because it has a girl on the boys' team. That would be unfair. You've never seen anything quite like the Neanderthals that were sitting around the MIAA table. Anyway, never mind. So Mike's son's team was in the tournament. We co-counseled this case. We won in Hampshire probate court. We won in the appeals court of the Commonwealth. Gateway beat Mike's son's team in the tournament, for which he's never forgiven me. No, that's not true. That's not true, for which he said, I'm really proud of what we did. And I will never forget the day we're having the hearing in court and the entire team comes to the courtroom. All the boys are wearing ties and jackets over their uniforms because they're on their way to a game. Any judge who could have turned that team down just wasn't breathing. And that, again, was community. And there were lots of letters to the editor, lots of support, again, because the community knew what was right, what was decent, and what was just. We won that case. Okay, now to questions. Yes?
I wonder if you could talk sort of more generally about two problems with the American legal system. And I want to be clear that I would rather be in the American legal system than in Saudi Arabia or Russia. But one is the fact of pro bono. Why do we have a system where money carries such tremendous influence on seeking justice? So that's the first question. And do you see any way around that where the influence of money could be at least reduced? And the second is somewhat related to what you talked about earlier. Judges have tremendous power. They can do things like, for example, just not rule on a motion to dismiss. They can just let it run out. And of course it's related to money because then you just can't keep the case going because you don't have the resources. So the system is set up in a potentially very, very fair way, but the influence of money and the influences of judges who can, and I don't mean judges who rule in a way that you don't like, because that's always going to be true, right?
It's going to be more true in the next few years.
Yes, yeah, or the next 30 years, yeah, right. But do you see any way to at least mitigate some of these systemic problems?
Do I see a way? Yes.
Okay.
Let me give you a couple examples. Because when you are asking the system to pay for something that private resources can buy, you're never going to get the same quality. So, when I was doing this case with Brian, our client ended up on in the cell next to the execution chamber because he didn't have the money to pay the filing fee in federal court. It was an afternoon I was going out for lunch with Robbie Mirapol, and I said, this has too many ironies. I don't know if I can deal with this, really. And obviously it worked out. But a big part of the case had to do with the inability of our client to have the resources made available to him so he could, in fact, present mitigation evidence on his own behalf. Theoretically, does he have the right to that? Yes. Is the Supreme Court precedent clear? Yes. Did he ever get the money? No. I served on the board of Western Massachusetts Legal Services, now Community Legal Aid, for 28 years. And does that make civil legal services available to poor people in the same way that they're available to people with means? No. Does it improve the situation? Yes. Does legal services provide what needed legal services to half the people who call? No, less. And are those half that don't get services, are they theoretically and technically eligible? Yes. So there are ways in which the system can be made fairer through this. This is kind of a problem that liberals should love. You can solve it by throwing money at it. And I'm serious about that. More money, more resources would make more justice available. As long as we have a system that is based on purchasing of resources, those with more are going to be able to purchase more justice in the main. Is it possible to make it better? Yes. Has it been made better? Yes. Do I see vast improvements over the inequality that's going on today and that continues to go on? Not anytime soon. I'm such a bummer. I really am. I hate that part about me, but I'm sorry, but that's really how I see it.
How about the judges?
You know, I still have to appear in front of a few of them. What do you mean, what about the judges? I mean, there's always going to be an enormous amount of discretion in trial judges, and the idea that appeals will fix the issues is true in a minority of the cases. I think a small minority of the cases. Look, in our death penalty case, the judge found 7 constitutional errors. 7! Wow. So we got a new trial, right? Wrong. We didn't, because he found 6 of them to be constitutional harmless errors. Now, I never quite understood that in law school. If it's a constitutional error, how can it be harmless? I mean, it's a big deal. It's a constitutional error. It's not a little evidentiary error. It's a constitutional error. 6 constitutional harmless errors, according to the judge. He didn't find that the error at the penalty phase was harmless, and so we received a new trial on the penalty phase, and eventually he received a sentence of life with the possibility of parole. But 7 constitutional errors, including your motion for funds was denied, harmless. If he had had money, he would have been able to get psychiatrists, psychologists, educators. Yes, all those people can be found pro bono, maybe, but very, very, very difficult to do after the fact and on a motion for a new trial or in a habeas motion, habeas petition. Other thoughts, musings, questions? Anyone want to make this a little lighter? Yeah.
Lighter, or maybe it's not. I just wanted you to think a little bit more about your narrative before you started it, because it starts in 1968, I think, the story you told. But of course, there's a lot that led up to 1968, and I'm thinking there must have been a lot that led up to your choosing to go to Antioch rather than someplace else, because back then that was a pretty radical place. So I'm wondering how the larger political context, which might also have been a context of community, how that shaped the person who got to 1968 in New York City.
Okay, so I do tell the story in here, but I'll give you a little bit, just a teaser, so you're going to buy the book, right? I went to see the college advisor at Hotchkiss, and his name's George Kellogg, and Mr. Kellogg and I had a bit of a contentious relationship. He didn't think I had the appropriate school spirit. He he was right. But he said something to me that resonated, and it was, I told him about where I was applying, and I knew about as much about this as any other high school student, which is far less than you think, but names. And I said, I thought this was really good on my part. I said, well, Mr. Kellogg, do you have any suggestions? Yes. And he said, well, a place like Antioch might want you. And I was struck by that because I was pretty confident. I was at Hotchkiss. I was in the top third of my class, give or take, until I decided not to go to class the last half of senior year because I was accepted at Antioch, early decision. But I was in the top third of the class, and so I was going to be accepted at a good school. But it had never occurred to me that some college might want me. I understood they might accept me, but want me affirmatively, want me to be there. That was interesting, and that was when I actually read about Antioch. I never heard about it before that. Learned about the work-study program, was very impressed by the fact that 50% of the students dropped out, and said, I want to apply to this place. And I did, early decision, and never regretted it. Well, I'm not saying it was easy. I think it was a really hard place to go to school, but that made the difference to me. I had no idea what I was getting into. And I was so ill-prepared. It made me furious at Hotchkiss because, of course, they said, well, you're prepared for the world. I didn't know bupkis. I was so naive about race and class and gender, social skills of a gnat. But it was sink or swim, and swimming was slightly easier.
How did you decide to begin with your radio show? How did that
Finally, someone with a nice, light question. Thank you so much. I had been recording the podcast, the Civil Liberties Minute, which I should admit it's 90 seconds, I know. But we started out as the First Amendment Minute because we liked the alliteration. So it was close enough, minute, 90 seconds, whatever. And WHMP had an opening. Bill Dwight was no longer there. I did really petition the station for Bill to not be somewhat unceremoniously left without a job there. But 6 months had gone by, and I was offered a show on Saturday morning. I said no. And he said, how about every day? I said, that sounds impossible. But, and then I went home and said to Dale, what do you think about my having a radio show every morning? And she said, you're out of your mind. And then I said, well, let's try that. She didn't say she was leaving. She just said I was out of my mind. So that was pretty good.
Asked you what you were going to give up, which is what we used to say to our kids when they had a new idea of an activity.
Yeah, and I think my kids are brilliant in that regard. Never gave up anything. So really, it was let's try this and see how it goes. I thought it was interesting. I had filled in for Bill, I don't know, maybe a dozen times while he had been on vacation, so I knew something about it. And I met this guy, Monty, who I said, well, he's pretty interesting. So sure, let's try this. And that was almost 9 years ago. I don't say it just goes on, but it goes on, and I've really enjoyed it because I learn something every day. Bruce.
Bill, one of the reasons why we came up from Connecticut is that I have listened to you for a long, long time. And you have, and I don't want you to respond to this.
Anyone else think this is not going well?
Many of us are extremely frustrated with the state of the country. And some of your comments are a bright light, common sense, as to where we should be going. And I've really enjoyed listening to you, and I don't expect you this evening to elaborate on that. I just wanted to make that comment.
Well, thank you very much. What did we have to pay you for that? Thank you so much. That's very kind. Anyone else have something nice to say? Questions, thoughts, musings? Well, I want to thank you all so very much. I want to thank Historic Northampton. It's been a pleasure for me to speak with you. I appreciate your time and your attention, your thoughts and comments, and I hope it's been worthwhile for you, or at least somewhat interesting. And so I thank you all very much.